Hello and welcome back. It's an exciting day for us because we're moving up a rung on the ladder today. We're going up one level in the levels of linguistic description. So we're done with phonetics. Phonetics was about the mechanics of how sounds are articulated. Now we're going to start thinking about how sounds are put together in languages to form words. We've seen that in continuous speech, segments, which are the individual units of sound within speech, are put together to form syllables. That's a little bit of how sounds go together, but we haven't yet looked at questions like, are there constraints on what sounds go together in a language? When we put sounds together, do they interact with each other? Do they change each other in any particular ways? When we pronounce a word, do we always pronounce it exactly the same, or do some of the phonetic features vary from one pronunciation to the next? These topics go beyond phonetics and into what we call phonology. We're done with phonetics now, moving up to phonology, which is the structure of sounds. And here's what we mean by that. Phonology is the structure of sounds as they combine together to form words and utterances in a language. So this means that we're going to start thinking about different languages now. Different languages have different phonologies. They have different systems, different structures of sounds, different constraints on sounds. We're going to start to build a bridge between sounds and words and sentences and meaning. So phonetics was all about these low-level mechanics of sounds. Now we're going to start building up larger and larger levels of analysis until we can start talking about things like meanings of sentences, and phonology is going to be the first step of that bridge. Languages have systematic constraints on what sounds go together and how sounds change depending on their context. And that's what phonology is all about. So to get started with phonology, we'll start with an English example. And I'd like to just go through a few examples of words, pairs of words in English. And I'm going to ask you, do the sounds indicated by the underlined letters in the spelling, do they really correspond to the same sound phonetically? And I want you to say these words slowly, articulate them carefully, and think about, are these really the same sound? Both listen to what you're saying and also feel what you're saying. Are these the same sound? So here are two words, spat and pat. Spat and pat, and I'm underlining the letter P. So say these words, spat and pat. Do those sound like the same sound? So in a broad phonetic transcription, like we've been learning how to do so far in this class, then yeah, you would say they're the same. We would indicate spat with a s, p, a, t. We would indicate pat with a p, a, t in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Remember, a broad transcription only indicates sort of the most important phonetic features of what's being pronounced. But take a listen, spat and pat. The P sound is a little bit different in those. It sounds like maybe in pat, it comes with maybe a little bit more breath, a little bit of a puff of air, pat versus spat. In the broad transcription, we'll still do them the same, but we're going to see that in a narrow transcription, these are actually different. Another example, the word cat and the word can. Let's think about the vowel sound that is shared, maybe, in these two words, cat and can. Do they sound the same? Are these the same vowel? At first glance, you might think, yeah, they sound the same. It's cat and can. It's the low front lax vowel a in English. Sounds the same, right? Well, we're going to see. Cat and tack. I'd like to draw your attention to the sound k here, the unvoiced velar stop, indicated with a K in the International Phonetic Alphabet. The sound in cat and the sound in tack. Is the k sound there really the same? Cat and tack. Now let's look at the narrow transcriptions. We're going to now say the words more slowly maybe and really, really think, are these the same sound? We're going to pinpoint the ways in which they're not the same sounds. So when we say spat, I'd like you to put your hand to your mouth when you say spat and when you say pat. Spat and pat. And I'd like you to feel if there is a big puff of air on your hand. When you say spat, spat, there's going to be a small puff of air. When you say pat, pat, there's a big puff of air. These sounds are actually different. In pat, the sound is what we call aspirated, which we indicate using this little H over the consonant in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So in pat, the P sound is an aspirated P. And in spat, there's not as much breath. It's an unaspirated P. So there's actually a difference here in how these are pronounced. There's a difference in the phonetic features. This aspiration thing, this means that a consonant is pronounced with a little puff of air. It's written with the International Phonetic Alphabet diacritic, this little H. So you see that in these narrow transcriptions. Spat and pat. Surprisingly, although the P sound appeared to be the same to you as English speakers, it actually is phonetically different. Another example is cat and can. Again, we see this aspiration here on the K, but that's not the important part. I'd like to draw your attention to the vowel. In cat and in can, and in particular to the nasalization of the vowel. So when you say cat, you have a vowel which is not nasal. Let's test for nasality. Remember, your test for nasality is you put your fingers to your nose. For a nasal consonant or a nasal vowel, you're going to feel this vibration in your nose when you're pronouncing it. For a oral consonant or oral vowel, non-nasal, then you don't feel that vibration. Now when you say cat, 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 no vibration in the nose, so that is a non-nasal vowel. That's just a normal ah vowel. Now say can. Say it slowly. Can, can. You'll feel that, in fact, your nose is vibrating during the vowel ah in can. The vowel is nasalized. Can. So it turns out that phonetically, the vowel in cat and the vowel in can are different. In can, it's nasalized. In cat, it's not nasalized. These things might have seemed the same, but they're actually phonetically different. Last example is cat versus tack. Again, this has to do with aspiration. So think about the sound k in cat, cat, very aspirated, and think about the k sound in tack, tack, not aspirated at all, tack. You should not feel the puff of air for tack, but you will feel it in a big way for cat. So the point here is that we had these sounds which at first glance appeared to be the same, but they actually have these little phonetic gradations to them, like aspiration and nasalization. What is going on? What is going on here? In order to explain this, I'm going to have to introduce a distinction between a sound which is contrastive and a sound which is not contrastive. This has to do with particular language you're speaking, as we'll see. So we can ask a question like, is the difference between the sound aspirated pa, as in pat, and unaspirated pa, as in spat, is that difference contrastive in English? How about the difference between the unnasalized vowel a and the nasalized vowel eh? So the unnasalized vowel as in spat and the unnasalized vowel as in cat and the nasalized vowel as in can. Two sounds are contrastive if, when you interchange the sounds, you also change the word that is being said. So for example, the sounds V and F in English, that's the voiced and unvoiced labiodental fricatives. Are these contrastive in English? They are. Because you can find a word like vase. That's a word in English that means, an object you would find in a house maybe, a vase that has the voiced labiodental fricative. And if you just interchange that for the unvoiced labiodental fricative F, so you drop in an F for the V, you get face, which is a different word with a completely different meaning. Vase and face are two words that are distinguished only by this difference in the sound V versus F, and they are two distinct words in the English language. This pair of words, vase and face, is what we call a minimal pair. A minimal pair is a pair of distinct, different words in a language which differ only in one sound. And the existence of a minimal pair demonstrates that that particular pair of sounds is contrastive. So the difference between V and F in English is contrastive because we can find this minimal pair, vase and face. In general, suppose you want to determine if two sounds, X and Y, are contrastive. Step one is find a word containing X, then substitute Y instead, and then you ask, is that a different word? Let's do some examples in English. The sound pa, aspirated pa as in pat, and the sound b, the bilabial stop, the voiced bilabial stop b. Are these contrastive? Well, to do this, we have to find a word that has one of the sounds, drop in the other sound, and we see, is it a different word? So think for a moment. Just come up with a word that has a voiced bilabial stop b in it in English. Try dropping in the aspirated, unvoiced bilabial stop pa. So let's say you started with bat. That's an English word that has the voiced bilabial stop b. You drop in the p, the aspirated, unvoiced bilabial stop p, and you get pat. So you start with bat, you get pat. This shows that the distinction between these two sounds is contrastive in English. How about this? The aspirated unvoiced stop P and the unaspirated unvoiced stop B. Are these contrastive in English? Can you find a word where it has the P in it, the aspirated P, you drop in the unaspirated P, and you get a different word, or the other way around? Well, can you think of any? Let's try some. You won't find any. Here's an example. We have spat, that has the unaspirated unvoiced stop B, ba, as in spat, and pat, that doesn't count as a minimal pair because these words do not differ in only one of their sounds. So if you try to take one of these and drop in the other sound, if you take pat and try to drop in the unaspirated P there, it would be hard for you to pronounce unless you're trained in phonetics. If you try to drop in the unaspirated stop in pat, what you get at is pat, which just sounds like some kind of variant of the same word, right? It's not a different word, it's just a variant. So whether or not a sound P comes out as aspirated or not in English depends on the phonetic environment. The sound P is going to be unaspirated after an S, and it's going to be aspirated when it comes at the beginning of a word, not after an S before a vowel. The general sort of rule for English is that the sound P is going to appear aspirated at the word beginnings, except following S. Otherwise, you're going to get the unaspirated P. Here's another example. Are the sounds N and the sounds M contrastive in English? Now looking at the nasal consonants. So in order to answer this, you need to find a minimal pair. So that means find a word with N or a word with M, drop in the other thing, and see if you get a different word. So think about it for a minute. Try to come up with a sound with a word that has an N in it, and then you drop in an M instead, and you see, is it a different word? Yes. It shouldn't be too hard to find an example like this. An example would be like kin, like my kin, someone who's in my family, and Kim, which is a name. It's a different word. How about N and eng? Remember, eng is the velar nasal in English. We don't really have a letter for this in English. It's usually spelled with an ng when it shows up at the end of a word. Well, can you find a minimal pair for N and eng? That would answer the question, are these sounds contrastive in English? So think about it. Try to find a word with an N, and then see if you can drop in an eng and see if it's a different word. Give it a moment to think. You can pause, you can take out some paper, write down some examples. Can you find a minimal pair for N and eng in English? So it could be quite similar to the one for N and M. Here's the one I came up with is kin, again, like my family, my kinsman, kin. Drop in an eng instead and you get king. So the difference between N and eng is contrastive in English. There are minimal pairs, like kin and king. These are two distinct words, totally distinct meanings. They differ only in this contrast of sounds, N versus eng. We conclude that N and eng are contrastive in English. Although note, you can't just drop in an eng sound anywhere you want in English and still get an English word. So for example, English does not permit words that have the eng, the velar nasal, at the beginning of a word. Like you couldn't take a gnat and drop in an eng and get ngat, ngat. That's not a possible English word. That We will eventually talk about the restrictions on possible words and languages. That's something called phonotactics. We're going to get there soon. But basically, a word like ngat with a velar nasal at the beginning is not allowed in English. The velar nasal in English is only allowed in syllable codas. So that's the restriction in English. How about m versus eng? So can anyone think of any examples that contrast m and eng in English? So think about it a bit. You can pause and ponder. What I came up with is sum, as in a sum of numbers, and sung, which is the past tense of sing. Those are two words which differ only in the distinction between m and eng, so m and eng are contrastive in English. All right. So just to sort of summarize what we've discovered here about the structure of sounds in the English language, we have the sound m and the sound n. They're contrastive because we found a minimal pair. We have the sound n and the sound eng, and they're contrastive because we found a minimal pair. We have the sound m, the sound eng, again, contrastive. When it came to the bilabial stops, though, the picture was different. So between pa and ba, we found minimal pairs like pat and bat. So they're contrastive. Between pa and the unaspirated ba, as in spat, we didn't find minimal pairs. We didn't find minimal pairs for these two sounds, so they're not contrastive. Then for ba and ba, are they contrastive? The unaspirated p and the voiced b, can you find a minimal pair for these? I'd like you to pause and ponder, think. I'll give you a hint. So a p is generally unaspirated at the end of a word. So something like lap has an unaspirated p. And now the question is, can you form a minimal pair of unaspirated p as in lap with the voiced b as in lab? So lap and lab, that's a minimal pair, demonstrates that these two are contrastive. So we have a three-way contrast here among the nasals and based on their place of articulation in English. And we have only a two-way contrast here among the consonants based on their aspiration and voicing. So we found that the aspirated pa as in pat and the unaspirated ba as in spat and lap are not contrastive in English. There's a distinction here in sounds which exists phonetically, but it's not contrastive when it comes to distinguishing one word from another in the English language. What about other languages? It turns out that what sounds are contrastive actually depends on the language you're speaking. Some sounds are contrastive in one language and not in another. So, for example, in Hindi, here's what Hindi looks like. We have a word like fruit, which the word for fruit in Hindi is phal, with an aspirated p, phal. We have a word like moment, which the Hindi word for that is bal, with an unaspirated, unvoiced p. And we have a word like strength. The Hindi word for that is bal, with a voiced bilabial stop, ba. So we actually have three different words, phal, bal, and bal, which are different. So we actually have minimal pairs for the aspirated pa as in pat in Hindi and the unaspirated ba as in spat in Hindi because there's a minimal pair in Hindi. Also, the unaspirated p and the voiced b are contrastive, and the aspirated p, pa, and the voiced b are contrastive. So there's a three-way distinction here. So this feature of aspiration of the consonant is contrastive in Hindi. For Hindi speakers, these three sounds, pa, ba, and ba, sound just as distinct as the sounds pa and ba do to English speakers. Even if it's hard for you to hear the difference between pa and ba, the aspiration distinction there, it's easy for someone who speaks a language in which this is contrastive to hear that difference. So the English picture looks something like this. We had the aspirated pa and the voiced ba, they're contrastive. We had the aspirated pa, the voiced ba, they're not contrastive. We had the unaspirated pa and the voiced ba. and they're contrastive. In Hindi, on the other hand, all three of these are contrastive. All right? So whether a sound is contrastive or not depends on the language. It has to do with the system and the structure of sounds in a language, and that's phonology. So if you aren't trained in phonetics, and you only know one language like English, it can be hard to even hear the difference between sounds like pa and ba, which are not contrastive in your language. This is actually something that develops very, very early for you. So it's easy for Hindi speakers to hear this distinction because it's contrastive in their language. It's going to be difficult for English speakers to hear it. When you learn a language, one of the things that you learn is to actually ignore the non-contrastive phonetic distinctions among sounds. This happens very, very early. So all infants, when they are 6 to 8 months old, with normal hearing, can perceive perfectly well the difference between a sound like an aspirated pa and an unaspirated ba. But then, by age 10 to 12 months, already the English learning infants can no longer perceive the difference. So when you're very, very young, when you're still an infant, you learn to pay attention to the contrastive phonetic distinctions in your language. And it starts to become hard for you to hear the difference between sounds that are not contrastive in your language. This is a very deep thing that is sort of wired into your brain in the course of learning a language as an infant. But Hindi-speaking infants can still perceive that difference. So when you're learning a language, you very rapidly learn to pay attention to the contrastive distinctions and ignore the non-contrastive distinctions. That's why this part of the class might be a bit tricky, because we're now dealing with these phonetic distinctions that might be a little hard to hear. But if you attune carefully, listen carefully, pay close attention to how you're articulating things, you can perceive these differences if you pay attention. Now, for the nasals, the nasal consonants in English, we had a structure like this. We had the velar nasal eng, the alveolar nasal n, and the bilabial nasal m. They're all contrastive with each other. You can sort of arrange them in a triangle like this, where they're all contrastive with each other, a three-way distinction. On the other hand, when we looked at the stop consonants, we had a structure like this. We had a distinction between the aspirated unvoiced stop and the voiced stop. We did not have a distinction between the aspirated and unaspirated unvoiced stops. And we did have a distinction between the unaspirated unvoiced stop and the voiced stop. So when you look at these figures, it sort of looks like maybe the sound pa, the aspirated one, and the sound ba, the unaspirated one, maybe those are actually two variants of the same sound. It looks like maybe there's actually underlyingly only two kinds of sound here. There's something which is kind of like an unvoiced pa, and there's a voiced ba, but that unvoiced one sort of shows up in two different forms. It could be aspirated or not, depending on the context. So the idea here is that maybe when you look at it this way, the aspirated pa, unaspirated pa are like two different versions of the same underlying thing. M and an eng are three totally different sounds. They're not variants one of the other because they're all contrastive. Pa and pa are two variants of the same sound which contrasts with the voiced ba. This leads us to really the central concept in phonology, the idea of a phoneme, the idea of phonemes. A phoneme is a perceptually distinct unit of sound which can appear as different phonetic variants in speech. Two sounds represent different phonemes if they are contrastive. For example, the phoneme P is an underlying category in the English language. It's a mental category that you have as an English speaker. The phoneme P can be realized in speech either as the sound aspirated pa or as the sound unaspirated ba, depending on the context. So it's underlyingly the same category, but it can be realized in speech using these two different forms. An allophone is a particular phone, a particular sound that realizes a phoneme. So we say that the sound aspirated unvoiced pa is an allophone of the phoneme P in English. And the unaspirated, unvoiced sound pa, as in spat, is also an allophone of the same phoneme P in English. So English has a structure which looks something like this. The phonemes, the underlying categories, and the allophones are going to be displayed with the phonemes on top and the allophones on the bottom. The phoneme is P, and it can appear either as aspirated pa as in pat or unaspirated pa as in spat. Same underlying category, which we write between slashes, and it's realized as two different allophones, two different concrete sounds, which we write in brackets. And the phoneme B, that's the voiced thing, is realized as the allophone voiced bilabial stop B. We can also look at some other examples of phonemes and allophones in English. So in English, we have like the phoneme V, that's the voiced labial dental fricative, which is realized in the same way as an allophone. And we have the phoneme W, that remember is the voiced labial velar approximant, wa, that's realized simply as itself in terms of its allophones. So we have this set of underlying categories, which is realized as a particular set of actual sounds in speech. The ones indicated in blue here are all contrastive with each other because they're separate phonemes. The one indicated in red here, the aspirated pa versus the unaspirated pa, those are not contrastive, and so they're considered to be realizations of the same phoneme. Now in Hindi, things are different. Remember, in Hindi, the sound aspirated pa was different than the sound unaspirated pa as in spat. So we had that minimal pair of pul versus bul in Hindi. That means that those two sounds actually represent different underlying phonemes in Hindi. And similarly, Hindi also has a phoneme B, the voiced bilabial stop. It also actually has a voiced aspirated bilabial stop bha, which is another phoneme, so you could find minimal pairs for all of these sounds in Hindi. But then Hindi actually lacks a distinction that English has. So in Hindi, the underlying phoneme w can be realized in different contexts, either as the sound v, the voiced labial dental fricative, or as the sound w, the voiced labial velar approximant. So in English, v and w were contrastive. They were different phonemes. In Hindi, they're not. In Hindi, these are both allophones of the same phoneme. So Hindi speakers will have difficulty distinguishing the sounds v and w in the same way that English speakers have difficulty distinguishing the sounds pa and pa. And so the pattern of contrastivity would look something like this. You would have contrastive pairs for all of these different phonemes, but you will not find a minimal pair. You will not find a contrastive example for the sound of v and the sound of w in Hindi. So this shows that which sounds are contrastive, which sounds indicate different phonemes, varies from language to language. Some languages have distinctions that other languages don't. Hindi has a distinction of aspiration, which English does not. On the other hand, English has a distinction between v and w, which Hindi does not. So a phoneme is a perceptually distinct unit of sound which can appear as many different phonetic variants in speech. A phoneme is fundamentally an abstract mental category. So unconsciously, you, as an English speaker, perceive the sound unaspirated pa as in spat and aspirated pa as in pat as the same thing, even though they're actually two distinct phonetic sounds acoustically and in terms of articulation, you still perceive them as the same thing at a very low level. You might be able to hear the difference when you pay attention. Like in this class, you've been trained to pay attention to phonetic distinctions, so you can hear the difference when you try. But in normal speech perception, you don't pay attention to this phonetic distinction because it's not contrastive in your language. The abstract mental category that underlies these two distinct phonetic realizations is the phoneme P. The phone, on the other hand, is the actual sound that can be produced by someone's vocal anatomy. So very important to understand the distinction between a phoneme and a phone. A phoneme is an abstract mental category. A phone is the actual sound that you produce with your mouth or your articulators. Identifying phonemes comes down to identifying minimal pairs. So if you want to know if X and Y are two different phonemes, if two sounds X and Y are realizations of two different phonemes in a language, then you need to look for minimal pairs. The procedure is, you ask, can you find a minimal pair contrasting the sound X and the sound Y? Remember, a minimal pair is a pair of distinct words that differ only in that the sound Y is substituted for the sound X. If yes, X and Y are contrastive. Therefore, X and Y represent two different underlying phonemes. Now, the sounds which realize phonemes, the allophones, often appear in what's called complementary distribution. Allophones of the same phoneme usually appear in complementary distribution, which means that those two sounds appear in different phonetic environments. So the phonetic environment determines which allophone you're going to get. You can think of this as kind of like Clark Kent and Superman. Underlyingly, they're the same guy, right? They're both the same individual Kal-El. On an ordinary day, you see Clark Kent. In a situation of distress, you see Superman. You never see both of them together. Depending on the context, you see one or you see the other, but underlyingly, they're the same guy. Similarly, a phoneme is an underlying category of sound, and in English, the phoneme P only appears in the context of after the sound S or at the end of a word, and the sound aspirated P shows up elsewhere, everywhere else. So depending on the context, you're going to see one form or the other of the same underlying sound. The different forms are called allophones. The underlying sound is called a phoneme. Now, as an example of complementary distribution, let's look at the distribution of the allophones, nasalized and oral in English. So to do this, we're going to have to find examples of a bunch of words which contain either the nasalized or the oral in English. And we're going to test which form they have. If you can't hear the distinction yet, then remember you can feel whether you have vibration in your nose when you are pronouncing the vowel. Let's take a look. So we need to collect examples of these two allophones, these two sounds in English. So we can collect examples of the nasalized and the oral, unnasalized We can start off with the examples that I used to introduce this distinction. So we had the word can in English, which phonetically is can with a nasalized vowel. When you say can, you can feel the vibration in your nose while you are articulating the vowel. And as our example of the oral vowel, we had cat, which is cat. Feel your nose, cat, no nasalization. So now, let's try to think of some other examples of words that have the vowel a. Let's just think of one-syllable words that have the vowel a, and we can check, is that vowel nasal or is it not nasal? And by doing this, we can figure out the conditioning environment. We can figure out when the vowel shows up as in its nasalized form and when it shows up in its unnasalized form. Okay, how about hand? The word hand. Feel your nose. Hand. It's vibrating during the vowel, so that is nasalized. So we have hand. Phonetically, hand with nasalization. How about something like lab? That has the vowel a, lab. Check, is it nasal? Lab. It's not nasal. So lab is phonetically lab, not nasal. We can think of some other examples. How about last, 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 not nasal. How about ram, like the kind of a car, or like the animal, a ram, Ram, ram. It's nasal. The vowel is nasal. Your nose is vibrating while you are articulating the vowel. So we have ram. How about mad? The word mad, like I'm mad. Let's see, mad. We'll feel for nasality, mad. Well, your nose is vibrating during the M. Remember, that's a bilabial nasal. Mad. But during the vowel, the vibration stops. Mad. So the vowel there is not nasalized. And the last example, how about the word sang? Like I sang a song. That has the vowel a. Sang, sang. It's nasalized, right? So sang is going to be. So we've now collected a bunch of examples of cases where we have the nasalized form of the vowel or the unnasalized form of the vowel. Remember, two allophones of the same underlying phoneme. And we're ready to state the distribution of the allophones. What is the phonetic environment that determines whether you get a nasal eh versus a oral a? Well, just take a look. What is in common here? Well, this n has an n after the vowel. This has an n after the vowel. This has an m after the vowel. This has an eng after the vowel. It looks like when the vowel comes before one of these consonants, the vowel is nasalized. Otherwise, in all these other examples, it's not nasalized. So, what are the phonetic environments observed for nasalized eh? That it happens before m, before n, and before eng. And what are the phonetic environments observed for the oral vowel a? It's just everywhere else. Everywhere else. So this is complementary distribution. A and eh are in complementary distribution. There's a particular phonetic context which determines whether you get the nasal eh versus the oral a. So this is again like Clark Kent and Superman. The underlying individual, the underlying category is the phoneme a, the underlying mental category. And that's realized as the sound nasal eh when it appears before m, n, and eng. And otherwise it comes out as the oral vowel a. This is what's called a conditioning environment. The conditioning environment for the nasal allophone eh is before m, n, or eng. Right there. So those are three different conditioning environments that determine that you're going to get the allophone nasalized eh. When an environment determines which allophone appears, we call that a conditioning environment for the allophone. So when you have complementary distribution, that means that there exists a conditioning environment which determines which allophone you get. Now, it's also possible to have a difference between allophones which are not in complementary distribution. So this is a situation called free variation. Free variation means that which of the two allophones appears in speech is essentially random. It's not a function of your phonetic environment. It's just like you could pronounce it one way, you could pronounce it another way. It's just completely random. It's up to you. An example of this in English has to do with this phonetic feature called releasing for a stop. So for example, let's take the word leap in English and we'll do a narrow transcription of it. So it could be pronounced leap, ending with an unaspirated, unvoiced bilabial stop p, leap, leap. Or it could be pronounced leap, leap. You see, in the second case, I'm not actually releasing the stop. In the first case, it's leap, leap. In the second case, it's leap with no release. So you just sort of stop your air and you never release it. That's called an unreleased stop. In English, a unvoiced consonant at the end of a word, an unvoiced stop, could be released or it could be unreleased, and it's in free variation. You see that there's not a phonetic environment which determines whether you're going to get the released or the unreleased stop. Another example would be in the word troop. It could be troop with a release at the end or troop with no release at the end. Another example is soap. Could be soap released or soap unreleased. Are these contrastive? Well, they're the same word. Whether you have the released stop or the unreleased stop, it's still the word leap or the word troop or the word soap, all the same word. So this is not a contrastive distinction. So therefore, these must be allophones of the same underlying phoneme. There's no minimal pairs for this distinction between released and unreleased stops in English. But are they in complementary distribution? No. You can't identify a particular phonetic environment which will cause you to have the released stop versus the unreleased stop. It's just sort of random. So this is what we call free variation. So now, to summarize the concepts that we've learned in this lecture, I realize this is a lot of new stuff. We've covered all of the fundamental concepts of phonology in just this lecture, and from here on out we're going to be applying this stuff, reviewing it, and going into more detail. Two sounds are contrastive if and only if there is a minimal pair for them in a language. A minimal pair is a pair of words that differ only by one sound. A phoneme is an underlying sound, an underlying mental category, which can be expressed as multiple phonetic variants, which are called allophones. Speakers of a language perceive allophones of a phoneme sometimes as the same sound. Allophones can exist in either complementary distribution, which means that there is a conditioning environment which determines which allophone you get, or free variation, which means that whichever allophone you get is random. A conditioning environment is a phonetic environment, a phonetic context which determines which allophone will appear.